What would your younger self say about how your family turned out?
Every single year, my family uploads a birthday group shot without me, and I do not mean they forgot to tag me, or I was standing behind someone, or I blinked and they chose a different picture. I mean I am not there, because I was never invited. And the caption always says something like, full family birthday dinner, as if I do not exist, as if I am a distant acquaintance who wandered off years ago and never came back. And this year they went a step further and posted the photo at 8 in the evening with a cake and a candle and my mother's comment saying, couldn't love this family more, and I stared at that screen in my kitchen and felt that old tightness in my chest that starts like a pin and then spreads until your shoulders lock. While the little voice that learned to be calm told me to breathe and not fire off a text I would regret, because we have been here before and every time I bring it up I am told I misunderstood, or I should have said something earlier, or I was probably busy. Or they assumed I was traveling or writing or tired, which is their polite way of saying the quiet part out loud, that I am easier to erase than to include, and they will keep erasing me as long as I keep acting like it does not matter. I used to think this dynamic started when I moved out of state for work, because distance is a convenient villain, but if I am honest, the pattern was already there when I was a teenager and my brother, who my mother calls a natural leader and my father calls a closer, soaked up the oxygen in every room, and I learned to sit on the edges and make myself useful, which is a skill until it becomes a habit. And then one day you're in your 30s, and you realize you have made it effortless for people to forget you without even feeling guilty, because you train them to believe you are fine with the scraps, the late invites, the oops we thought you were slammed, the pictures posted with captions about how everyone showed up, and sure, sometimes I did have deadlines and sometimes I did miss flights, but I can count on one hand the times they shifted anything to make space for me, and that is the part that stings even when you have lived with the sting long enough to predict it. What made this year land differently was not the photo or the caption, it was the word choice, because they wrote full family and tagged everyone, including a couple of cousins who live 2 boroughs away and a neighbor who houses it's their dog. And somehow I am the one who did not make the cut, and when I say that out loud I hear how petty it sounds, and I also hear the chorus of explanations they will throw at me if I text. So I did what I do when I need to stop myself from taking the bait, which is open a blank note and write down the facts like I am building a case for a stranger, and the facts are boring and brutal. There have been more than 10 birthday dinners over more than 10 years. My presence was requested fewer than 5 times. And on the years I was asked it was last minute, as if they remembered just before the candles, and no one, not my mother, not my father, not my golden brother Nate, ever called me the next day to ask how I felt about being busy again. They simply posted the photo, accepted the likes, and moved on. The reasonable part of me keeps trying to negotiate, because that part thinks solutions are found in clear sentences and phone calls, and I have done the calls, I have done the careful words, I have done the I want to be included without making it a fight, and the response is always some mix of we love you, we thought you had a thing, and why make this public, which is the tell, because what they really care about is not the reality but the optics, and the internet is their storefront window where the family looks polished and united, and I have been the one who quietly cleaned the glass while they enjoyed the reflection. So I made a decision that surprised even me, not because I am fearless, but because I am tired of being polite while I am being erased, and I decided I would not text, I would not call. I would not ask for a seat that they keep pretending is reserved for someone else. I would do something that keeps my dignity intact and still lands. And before you think I mean a screaming post or a long thread, I mean something smarter and cleaner. Something that uses their own love of public image against them, without dragging anyone through mud, because I am not interested in punishment. I am interested in leverage, especially the kind that turns a soft voice into a microphone they cannot mute. Here is what I did, and it was small enough to look harmless, but pointed enough to leave a mark. I pulled up one of those memory features that throws old photos into your feed, and I found a birthday shot from years ago. One where I was there because I had flown home on short notice and ended up taking the picture so I was not in it, and I reposted it with a calm caption that said, "This is the year I took the picture," and I added, "Funny how the person behind the camera never shows up in the album." And I tagged no one, I named no one, I offered no accusation. I simply let people do the math, and within an hour my aunt who notices everything commented with a heart and a "you were always there." And then my cousin DM'd me asking if I was okay, and then Nate texted me a single line that said, "Why would you post that?" which translated to, "You punctured the image," and I stared at that text and felt, for the first time in a long time, the shift that happens when you stop begging. 2. Be seen and start setting the terms. I did not argue with him. I did not delete the post. I did not apologize. I replied with one sentence that said, "Because it's true," and then I put my phone face down and opened my laptop, because the next move, the one I had been thinking about in the background for months, was going to require time, money, and a level of nerve I usually save for quiet victories, and if I was going to make them look up without saying my name, I needed to plan it right. And I needed to do it without tipping my hand, which meant keeping one very big secret exactly where it had lived all year, away from their opinions, away from their casual dismissals, and right under their noses. When I woke up the next morning, the first thing I saw on my phone was the same group shot from the night before being reshared by different relatives, all with their own captions about what a perfect evening it had been, and I lay there staring at those smiling faces, trying to decide if it was worse that they had excluded me again or that they were so comfortable doing it openly, without the slightest hesitation that maybe, just maybe, it might look strange to other people that one immediate family member was never anywhere to be seen. I could hear the familiar arguments playing in my head before they even reached me, that I was busy, that I was working, that I didn't like big dinners, that I should have called if I wanted to come. And I realized that in all the years this pattern had been going on, I had been carrying the heavier end of the bargain by swallowing my reaction, letting them off the hook, and giving them the benefit of the doubt they had never earned. It was not just about one dinner. It was about a decade of being treated as optional, about the cumulative weight of every time I had been left out of a frame and told it was an oversight, when deep down I knew it was not an accident but a choice made because I was the easiest to leave behind. I spent most of that day trying to keep myself occupied with work, but every time my phone lit up with another notification, my eyes went straight to the photo again, and the part that stuck in my throat wasn't even the absence, it was that caption. Full family birthday dinner, which carried an unmistakable message whether they intended it or not. You are not part of this. It reminded me of the year my father turned 60, and there was a big surprise party with all the extended family, and I only found out about it when someone posted a picture and tagged me in a comment saying, "Wish you could have been there." As if I had been out of the country or in a hospital instead of sitting at home less than 30 minutes away. I had let that one go because my mother had called afterward with a story about seating limitations and how they wanted to keep it intimate, but the truth was, no matter how many times I gave them an out, the result was the same. When it came down to deciding who was essential, I was never on the list. By mid-afternoon, the hurt had shifted into something else, something sharper and more productive, because I realized that every time I had confronted them before, I had been hoping they would see my side, understand how it felt, and change. But this was the year I understood that they were not going to change, at least not for me, and that I was wasting my time waiting for people to treat me differently when they had no incentive to do so. The truth is, when someone gets used to the idea that you will always be the one to bend, the one to forgive, the one to smooth things over, you have to do something so far outside of your usual pattern that it forces them to see you in a completely different way, even if it unsettles them. I sat at my desk, pulled up an empty document, and wrote out a list, not of every time they had excluded me, because that list was too long and would just make me angrier, but of the few moments in my life when I had truly felt seen without having to fight for it. It was a short list, but one item stood out immediately. The week I got an email from my publisher telling me that my book, the one I had been working on quietly for 3 years without a single mention to my family, had just climbed to the top spot in its category. I remembered the strange mix of pride and disbelief I had felt, and how I had deliberately kept it to myself, not because I wanted to hide it forever, but because I wanted to savor the feeling before handing it over to people who would either dismiss it or turn it into a backhanded compliment about how they never knew I could actually finish something like that. That book was my ace in the hole, and until that moment, I had not considered using it as leverage, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. My family thrives on appearances, on being able to tell stories about their collective success. And nothing disrupts a carefully curated image quite like a member they habitually treat as an afterthought suddenly outshining them in a way that is impossible to ignore. It had to be done carefully, though, not in a gloating, confrontational way that would let them frame me as bitter or petty, but in a way that would make them uncomfortable precisely because it was undeniable and public. The kind of thing that forces people to acknowledge you without giving them a chance to reframe it. By the time evening rolled around, I knew exactly what I wanted to do. I didn't want a conversation, I didn't want an apology, and I didn't want to get pulled into another round of family politics where my feelings were dissected and dismissed. What I wanted was for them to see something they could never erase, something that would lodge itself into their memory every time they opened their phones or walked past a screen, something that would flip the balance so that I was the one they couldn't pretend away. That's when I remembered the text my cousin had sent a week earlier about everyone flying to New York for our other cousin's wedding, and an idea started forming that was so far outside my usual moves that it actually made me laugh out loud. It would be bold, it would be expensive, and it would take more planning than anything I had done in years, but if I pulled it off, there would be no way for them to ever look at me the same again. And that was exactly the point. I had always been careful about what I shared with my family, not because I was trying to be mysterious or aloof, but because I had learned the hard way that some achievements are better savored in private than handed over to people who will either water them down, twist them into a joke, or use them as another way to compare you to someone else. 3 years earlier, when I first sat down to outline what would become my debut novel, I didn't tell anyone in my family, partly because I didn't want their skepticism hovering over me every time I hit a roadblock, and partly because I wanted at least one part of my life to belong entirely to me, free from their commentary and free from the quiet competition that seemed to run through every family gathering like an invisible current. I poured myself into that book in every spare moment, writing before work, after dinner, and on weekends when other people were out, and when it was finally finished and picked up by a small but passionate publisher, I allowed myself the quiet pride of knowing I had done something I had once thought was beyond me. When the book came out, I didn't do a big announcement, didn't send it to family members with inscriptions, didn't post it on every social platform. And the only people who knew were a handful of close friends and the community of readers I had slowly built online under a pen name that my family didn't even know existed. The sales started slow, which didn't bother me, because I had long since accepted that real success is rarely instant, and I kept writing, kept engaging with readers, and kept learning how the publishing world works. Then, almost out of nowhere, a popular blogger reviewed it, calling it one of the most unexpectedly engaging novels of the year, and within a week, the book shot up the rankings. I watched in stunned disbelief as it climbed, passing titles from well-known authors, until one morning I opened my email and saw the subject line from my publisher, "Congratulations, number 1." I sat there at my kitchen table, staring at those words, knowing exactly how seismic this would feel if my family had been with me on the journey, and also knowing exactly how little I wanted them to own any part of it. That number 1 ranking was the product of every hour I had worked alone, every choice I had made without their input, every time I had told myself to keep going when there was no applause, and it was mine in a way nothing else had been. But now, after the latest birthday exclusion and the casual way they had written me out of their definition of full family, I saw it differently, not just as an achievement, but as a weapon. The timing was uncanny. My cousin had just sent me that message about everyone flying to New York for the wedding, which meant there was a guaranteed window when every key member of my family would be in the same city, together, with their phones out, taking photos and posting updates. I thought about what it would mean for them to be walking through Times Square, because of course they would, it's practically required for out-of-town relatives, and suddenly, the image formed in my mind so clearly I could almost hear the collective silence it would create. A massive digital billboard, impossible to miss, with my book cover stretched across it, the words "Number 1 Bestseller" by Aaron Davis in bold across the top, and nothing else, no message to them, no passive-aggressive jab, just the raw, undeniable fact of my success staring down at them in a place that doesn't let you look away. I spent the next several days researching how much it would cost and how quickly it could be done, and while the numbers made my stomach tighten, because let's be honest, Times Square ad space is not something you impulse buy, I kept coming back to the same conclusion. It was worth it. This wasn't just about showing off, and it wasn't about revenge in the cheap, petty sense. It was about rewriting the script they had been using for years, the one where I was the background character in their family story. I wanted to replace that with a moment they couldn't crop out, couldn't downplay, couldn't ignore. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that the satisfaction wouldn't come from their reaction in the moment, though I was certain it would be unforgettable, but from knowing that every time they told someone about their trip to New York, the memory of that billboard would be baked into the story whether they admitted it or not. They could never again pretend I was just drifting along without ambition or accomplishments, because the evidence would be burned into their minds in 50-foot-high digital clarity. And perhaps the best part was that I wouldn't even have to mention it to them. The billboard would speak for itself, and the silence afterward, the way they would have to process it without my prompting, would be the real victory. By the end of the week, I had made the booking, time for the exact 2 days I knew they would be in the city. I didn't tell anyone, not friends, not colleagues, because I didn't want a single leak that could dull the impact. It was my secret, my plan, and my line in the sand. And as I closed the confirmation email, I felt a surge of something I hadn't felt in years when it came to my family, complete control. For once, they wouldn't decide whether I was seen or invisible. This time, I was taking that choice entirely out of their hands. Once I had the confirmation in my inbox and the invoice paid, which took a deep breath, a call to my bank to lift a limit, and a brief moment where I reminded myself that sometimes you buy peace with money because nothing else will purchase it. The whole thing shifted from a fantasy into logistics, and if there is one lane where I am dangerous, it is the lane where you hand me a plan and a calendar and dare me to thread a needle others keep missing, because I will take out a pen, make a grid, and turn chaos into steps until even the parts one cannot control start behaving like they are on my side. The wedding schedule helped more than any inside connection. Since the moment my cousin sent the itinerary, I knew exactly when the family would land, when they would check in, when the rehearsal dinner would end, and most importantly, when the out-of-towners would do that classic tourist loop that every relative does, the one that hits the same handful of landmarks in a predictable order. Because people like to feel that they saw the thing they have seen in 1,000 photos, and yes, Times Square is always in that loop, usually late morning or just after lunch when everyone needs a second wind and an excuse to stop and stare. I called the media buyer whose number was listed on the placement sheet and asked quiet questions that probably made me sound like a small agency, and he was patient in that transactional way that tells you he has heard everything, and he walked me through dwell times, rotations, content approvals, and file specs, and by the end of the call I had 2 critical facts that changed the game. First, that I could anchor my creative to a specific rotation block around midday and early afternoon for 2 days, and second, that I could place a short headline above the book cover without triggering a legal review, as long as it was factual and not defamatory. I said thank you, hung up, opened a new document, and wrote a line I had never let myself imagine saying out loud to my family, a line that was not a boast but a record. New York Times and Amazon category #1 bestseller by Aaron Davis. And even seeing those words on my screen made me sit back and breathe, because I understood how clean this would feel once it was up, not just for me but for every person who had ever been told to take the picture and step out of the frame. There were still a dozen ways it could have gone sideways, and I treated each one like a problem to prevent rather than a disaster to fix, because that is the difference between revenge that is loud and sloppy and revenge that is quiet and undeniable. I double-checked the flight tracker for their incoming planes, not because I wanted to meet them, but because I needed to confirm windows, and I set calendar alerts that would remind me to verify the creative had pushed to the screens before they left the hotel. I booked myself into a small, no-nonsense place within walking distance, not for comfort but for control, so that if the schedule shifted by an hour or the rotation hiccuped, I could be there without playing subway roulette. I prepped 2 versions of the creative in case a line needed to be swapped, and I gave the media team everything they could possibly ask for in advance so that on the days that mattered there would be nothing left to negotiate. And because my family is slippery when cornered and expert at rewriting history on the fly, I built a documentation trail that would outlast their memory games, not for Instagram and not to embarrass them, but for me. For the day 6 months from now when someone would say, it was not that big of a deal, and I would want to remember exactly how it unfolded. I reached out to a photographer I trusted, someone who knows how to be present without being seen, and I asked for a discreet couple of hours each day to capture the billboard at different points in the loop, not staged, not glossy. Just proof that it happened in the world and not only in my head. I did not tell her who I expected to walk by or why it mattered. I simply said I wanted clean shots of the creative in rotation and a timestamp, and she said she understood and would keep her distance, which was perfect. The last piece was the nudge, because while I believed they would end up in Times Square on their own, I did not want to leave it to chance, not after investing what I had invested. So I placed 3 tiny breadcrumbs that would pull them there without turning me into a tour guide. First, I sent my aunt, the one who always organizes group meals, a message suggesting a quick lunch spot near the theater district, nothing fancy, just the kind of place that shows up on listicles and makes people feel like they found a tip. And I framed it as a suggestion for the cousins rather than a directive, which meant it would travel through the chat as an option that sounded easy. Second, I texted my mother a calm note saying I hoped everyone had a great time and that if they had a spare hour they should check out the discount ticket booth because sometimes you get lucky, which, as anyone who has wrangled a family trip knows, is practically a homing beacon to the center of the square. Third, I responded to Nate's dry message about my earlier post with a neutral update about a friend's gallery in Midtown, knowing he would not go, but also knowing he would forward the address with a sarcastic comment like Aaron's artsy detour, which would drop a pin that kept the herd moving in the right direction. By the night before they arrived, everything that could be prepared was prepared, and the only thing left was to decide what I would do when the moment landed. Whether I would step forward and say hello or whether I would stay back and let them discover it without the release valve of looking at me, and I kept circling that choice without settling on it because there was a version of this where I shook hands, accepted congratulations, and allowed them to fold me back into the narrative as a sweet surprise they were happy to witness, and there was another version where I let the image do the work and denied them the chance to reframe my win as a family win, and I did not know which future I wanted more until I stood there the next day, heard the distant ripple of voices at the edge of the square, and looked up to see the first rotation begin. I stood half a block back with my hood up and my phone on silent, not because I wanted to play spy games, but because I needed the moment to land without my face becoming the outlet for everyone's reactions. And as the rotation ticked forward and the crowd shifted the way it always does in that place, I saw the familiar cluster moving as a unit the way families do when they travel, with my aunt staring, my mother commenting, my father scanning for someplace to sit, and Nate half a step ahead, like a tour leader who thinks he invented the route, and I felt that jolt of adrenaline that is part fear and part relief, because the planning had worked and the timing was exactly as promised. And I had a split second to decide if I wanted to step forward and make eye contact or stay still and let the screen do the talking, and in that split second I understood that the cleanest version of this victory was the one where I was not the messenger. So I took a breath, stayed where I was, and watched. The billboard flipped to the frame that had cost me money, sleep, and every ounce of nerve I had. There it was, no flourish and no commentary, just the book cover that had lived on my laptop for years and the line across the top that said, in clear words that even my most defensive relative could not argue with, that my novel was a #1 bestseller on the list that has made and broken careers for as long as we can remember, and the best part was the silence that fell in our little corner of the crowd. Because families like mine know how to fill any room with chatter and instructions and helpful suggestions, but there are not many words you can use to step around a fact that large when it is staring down at you from a building, and in that quiet I saw every micro-expression I have trained myself to clock. Shock first, and then calculation, and then the tug of pride that they would never admit was missing before, and for a beat I felt nothing but steady, not triumphant, not cruel. Just steady in a way I had not felt in years, because the thing I wanted them to see had finally become impossible to ignore. My aunt grabbed my mother's arm and said my name out loud like a question and a correction at the same time. My father pulled out his phone like a man who needs proof before he allows himself an opinion. And Nate tilted his head with that look he uses when someone else gets a promotion, the one that says he is already looking for the angle, and I thought about all the times he had told me I was too sensitive, that I made things complicated, that I should let stuff roll off, and I watched him try to keep his face neutral and fail, because even he could not pretend this was small, and it felt like a door inside me shut and locked, and the noise that usually rattled around in there went quiet. I did not want to be cruel, but I also did not want to become a prop in their story 5 minutes after they learned a new fact about me. So I stepped out from the crowd just far enough that any of them who turned would see me if they were actually looking and not just reacting, and I waited. My mother was the first to turn, and for a second I thought she might cry, and then I remembered that tears have always been her shortcut and her shield. So I kept my face calm and said hello in a tone that made it clear I was not begging to be folded back into their circle, and she said that they had no idea, and I said that was by design. And I let the words hang there because they were true and also because I wanted them to land, and Nate finally found his voice and asked why I would keep something like this from my own family, and I said that after enough years of being left out of the frame, I learned to stop announcing the good parts before people had earned the right to hear them, and I watched him try to absorb that without arguing the premise. My father, who has never been quick with apologies, said that this was impressive and that I should have told them, which is his way of trying to move the focus toward my supposed secrecy instead of their pattern, and I said that secrets and privacy are not the same thing, and that I had chosen privacy because it was the only thing that I could control. There was a long beat where I could have pivoted into peacekeeping, the role I used to play without even noticing, and I felt the old muscle twitch like a reflex, but I ignored it, because this moment wasn't about soothing anyone. It was about altering the balance that had lived lopsided for too long, and I pointed up at the screen as my frame returned for a second rotation and said that I had wanted them to see it for themselves, because I was done asking to be included. And my aunt squeezed my arm in that way she does when she wants me to accept a truce and move on, and I took her hand off gently and said that a truce would come later if it came at all, because right now I needed them to understand that calling a picture full family when your daughter is standing a subway ride away is not a small oversight. It is a choice, and choices have consequences, sometimes expensive, neon consequences that you cannot unfollow. They asked me to come to lunch, and I said I had plans, which was true because I had a reservation with the only person who needed celebrating that day, me, and I started to walk. And for the first time in years, I did not feel the pull to turn back and make sure they were not angry, because anger has always been their language when someone refuses to play along, and I was done speaking it. My phone buzzed with messages from cousins who had finally connected the dots and from friends who had seen the photos starting to circulate, and I smiled because the narrative would write itself now, and not because I had forced it with a public tantrum, but because I had made a precise move that fit the crime and fixed nothing while changing everything, which is sometimes the only kind of justice you can get in families like mine. In the days that followed, there were mea culpas and explanations, and an invitation to a May-up dinner that I politely declined, and I did not post a victory lap or a thread about boundaries or a manifesto. I simply kept writing and let the ad live in their heads, and if that sounds cold, then maybe you have not lived long enough being edited out of your own family album. Because there is a kind of warmth that grows when you finally stop performing for people who will never clap, and it is not the kind that needs witnesses. They will keep telling themselves a version where this was a misunderstanding and I overreacted, but every time they walk past a bookstore or see someone reading on a plane, they will remember that day in Times Square and the way their words dried up. And that is enough for me. I did not need them to love me differently to feel whole. I needed to stop asking for permission to exist, and I have, and whether they catch up or not is their work, not mine, and that is the ending I wanted all along, the one where I did not win an argument. I changed the rules, and then I walked away with my head up and my name exactly where I put it.